The most dangerous mistake someone can make is believing they already know how your story ends. Those words echoed through my mind as I wrapped my fingers around the fountain pen resting on the polished walnut conference table. Everyone in the room thought I was about to sign. My son, Brian, sat across from me with his hands folded neatly, avoiding my eyes in a way that reminded me of a little boy who knew he had done something wrong but hoped kindness would erase the disappointment. Beside him sat my daughter-in-law, Lauren. She looked flawless in her cream-colored blazer, her posture relaxed, her smile polished, and her confidence almost impossible to miss. If someone had walked into the room without knowing us, they would have assumed she was simply a devoted daughter-in-law helping an elderly widow through a difficult season. I knew appearances could be remarkably convincing. Attorney Samuel Brooks quietly arranged several folders in front of me before stepping back into his chair. His expression revealed nothing, exactly as a good attorney should. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago moved through another ordinary weekday. People hurried along busy sidewalks carrying coffee cups. Taxi cabs stopped at intersections. Office workers disappeared into glass buildings without realizing that inside this conference room, an entire family's future rested on a few sheets of paper. Lauren glanced toward the documents, then back at me. Her smile widened ever so slightly, almost as though she could already picture what life would look like once this meeting was over. During the past several months, she had become surprisingly certain about what would happen next. She spoke confidently about selling the family home because it was simply too much responsibility for someone my age. She had carefully explained how much easier my life would become if everything were simplified. She had already mentioned neighborhoods where Brian and I could live closer together, investment plans that sounded practical, and a future that somehow seemed to include decisions I did not remember making. Brian finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he said gently, "we all want whatever makes life easiest for you." His voice was warm, but something inside it felt rehearsed, as though he had practiced those words more than once before saying them aloud. I looked at him for a long moment before lowering my eyes toward the papers waiting for my signature. My late husband, Thomas, had always believed that signatures carried more weight than promises because once ink touched paper, there was rarely an easy way back. On our 25th wedding anniversary, he had given me the very fountain pen now resting beside my hand. "Never let anyone rush an important decision," he had told me with that quiet smile I missed every single day. Time has a way of exposing things that hurry tries to hide. I gently lifted the pen, turning it slowly between my fingers while complete silence settled over the room. Lauren shifted ever so slightly in her chair, her confidence untouched. She truly believed everything was under control. She believed every conversation during the past several months had led naturally to this moment. She believed this meeting was simply the final step in a process that had already been decided. I placed the pen back on the table without removing its cap. Lauren's smile paused for the first time that afternoon. Brian looked at me with quiet confusion. Samuel remained perfectly still. "Is something wrong?" Lauren asked with careful politeness. I met her eyes and answered just as calmly. "No. I simply learned that the most important decisions should never be made by the person who feels the most confident in the room." Neither of them understood what I meant. Neither of them knew that only 48 hours earlier, one unexpected telephone call had quietly changed everything they believed they had under control. 48 hours earlier, I had been standing alone in my kitchen watching the first light of morning spread across the hardwood floor that Thomas and I had chosen together nearly 35 years before. Since losing him 7 months earlier, the house had developed a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. Every room still held traces of him. His reading glasses rested beside his favorite chair. His gardening gloves still hung neatly inside the garage. Even the old coffee mug with a tiny crack near the handle remained in the cabinet because I could not bring myself to throw it away. Grief has a strange way of preserving ordinary things until they become priceless. I prepared a simple breakfast of toast and fresh fruit, poured myself a cup of coffee, and looked through the kitchen window toward the flower beds Thomas had planted every spring. The tulips had finally opened, filling the yard with color despite everything that had happened. Thomas used to say that flowers never worried about who deserved spring. They simply bloomed when the season arrived. I tried to remember those words whenever the loneliness became difficult. During the months after his funeral, Brian and Lauren had visited often. At first, I appreciated their company. They helped with paperwork, grocery shopping, and the endless small tasks that follow the loss of a spouse. Gradually, however, our conversations began changing. Lauren often mentioned how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large house alone. She suggested that selling it would remove unnecessary stress from my life. She spoke confidently about smaller homes, easier neighborhoods, and simpler routines. Brian usually nodded in agreement, assuring me they only wanted what was best for me. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. It never occurred to me that concern and certainty could sometimes sound remarkably alike. Around 10 o'clock that morning, my telephone rang. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another unwanted sales call, but something encouraged me to answer. "Mrs. Parker," the calm voice said, "this is Samuel Brooks. I represented Thomas during several legal matters over the years. If possible, I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you this afternoon." His tone was respectful, yet unusually serious. I immediately asked whether something was wrong. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Nothing is wrong, Mrs. Parker. There is simply something your husband asked me to discuss with you personally, if the appropriate circumstances ever arose." My heart tightened. Thomas had always been organized. Every important document inside our home had a clearly labeled folder. Every insurance policy, tax return, and investment statement was filed with remarkable precision. If Samuel was calling now instead of months earlier, there had to be a reason. We arranged to meet later that afternoon at his downtown office. After ending the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table for several minutes, staring into my untouched coffee as memories quietly surfaced. During the final year of his life, Thomas occasionally spent long afternoons reviewing paperwork inside his home office. Whenever I teased him for being overly prepared, he would simply smile and say that peace of mind was one of the greatest gifts a husband could leave behind. At the time, I assumed he was referring to practical matters. I had no idea he was quietly preparing for a day that neither of us truly believed would come. As I gathered my purse and car keys before leaving the house, I felt an unfamiliar mixture of sadness and curiosity. Whatever Samuel wanted to show me, I sensed it would change far more than paperwork. It would change the way I understood everything that had happened since Thomas was gone. Samuel Brooks welcomed me into his office with the quiet professionalism I had always associated with my husband. Thomas respected very few people without reservation, but Samuel had earned that respect over more than 20 years of friendship and legal work. His office overlooked the Chicago River, where sunlight reflected across the water in gentle waves, yet I barely noticed the view. My attention settled on a large cream-colored envelope resting neatly in the center of his desk. Samuel waited until I had taken my seat before speaking. "Mrs. Parker," he began softly, "Thomas left very specific instructions regarding this meeting. He asked that I not contact you unless I believed certain circumstances had developed after his passing." I looked at him with growing concern. "What circumstances?" I asked. Samuel did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands together and chose his words with great care. "Your husband never believed in making decisions based on fear or suspicion. He simply believed that people sometimes behaved differently when major life changes occurred. He wanted to be certain that, if you were ever asked to make permanent decisions about your future, you would do so with complete independence and full information." He slowly slid the envelope toward me. My name appeared across the front in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters made my chest tighten. For a brief moment, it felt as though he were still sitting across the breakfast table, smiling over his morning newspaper. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of neatly written stationery. The very first sentence stopped me completely. "My dearest Evelyn, if this letter has reached your hands, it means you are standing at a crossroads that I hoped you would never have to face alone." Tears blurred my vision, but I continued reading. Thomas did not fill the letter with warnings. He never mentioned Brian or Lauren by name. Instead, he wrote about patience. He reminded me that grief often made people vulnerable to decisions they would never make under ordinary circumstances. He told me that the greatest gift I could give myself after losing him was time. One sentence remained with me more than any other. "If anyone asks you to hurry, slow down. Important decisions become clearer when urgency disappears. I slowly lowered the letter and looked toward Samuel. Did Thomas expect something like this? I asked quietly. Samuel shook his head. He expected life to be unpredictable. That is why he planned carefully. He then opened another folder containing several legal documents dated almost a year before Thomas passed away. Your husband amended portions of his estate plan, Samuel explained. He instructed me to keep these documents sealed unless you first received independent legal guidance before making any permanent decisions involving the family home or major assets. Every page reflected Thomas's remarkable attention to detail. Nothing in those documents punished anyone or accused anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, every provision protected one simple principle. The final choice would always remain mine. Samuel explained each document carefully, answering every question without rushing me. As I listened, memories began connecting in ways they never had before. Lauren's repeated suggestions about simplifying my life. Her confidence whenever she discussed selling the house. Brian's increasing focus on practical matters instead of family memories. None of those moments seemed alarming by themselves. Together, however, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Before I left Samuel's office, he placed Thomas's letter back inside its envelope and handed it to me. Your husband trusted your judgment completely, he said. Everything he prepared was designed to protect that trust, not replace it. I held the envelope close as I walked back toward the elevator, realizing that Thomas had not tried to control the future. He had simply made certain that no one else could quietly take that choice away from me. I drove home from Samuel's office without turning on the radio. The silence inside the car felt different now. For months it had been the silence of grief. That afternoon it became the silence of understanding. Every traffic light gave me another moment to think about Thomas's letter and the careful way he had chosen every word. He had never asked me to distrust anyone. He had never tried to predict the future. Instead, he had reminded me that love should never require surrendering my own judgment. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized he had left me something far more valuable than instructions. He had left me confidence. I unlocked the front door and stood quietly in the entryway, looking at the photographs lining the hallway. There was Brian at 8 years old holding up his first Little League trophy with a missing front tooth and the biggest smile I had ever seen. There we were standing beside the Grand Canyon during a family vacation. Another picture showed Thomas planting the maple tree in our front yard while Brian helped him with a shovel that looked almost bigger than he was. Every photograph reminded me that families are not changed by one conversation. They change slowly, almost without anyone noticing. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Thomas's favorite chair beside the living room window. His letter rested on my lap as I read it once again, this time paying attention to the spaces between the sentences as much as the words themselves. He never spoke about fear. He spoke about patience. He never warned me about betrayal. He reminded me to think clearly. The more I reflected on his letter, the more small memories began fitting together. Lauren had started offering to organize our financial paperwork only weeks after Thomas's funeral. She insisted it would make life easier for me. A month later, she suggested replacing my longtime financial advisor because someone younger might have more modern ideas. Then came the conversations about selling the house. She always described it as concern for my comfort. Yet every discussion somehow ended with detailed plans for what should happen next. At first, I appreciated her willingness to help. Looking back, I realized she rarely asked what I wanted. She usually explained what she believed would be best. Brian changed much more gradually. That was probably why I struggled to notice it. He still hugged me when he visited. He still called every week. But our conversations slowly shifted. Instead of asking whether I wanted to keep the house, he asked when I thought I might be ready to let it go. Instead of talking about memories of his father, he focused on practical decisions that supposedly could not wait much longer. I never blamed him because I knew how deeply he missed Thomas too. Grief often makes people search for certainty, even when certainty does not exist. That evening I walked through every room of the house before going upstairs. I touched the banister Thomas had refinished by hand, straightened the quilt on our bed, and paused inside his study where every notebook still rested exactly where he had left it. I finally understood why he spent so many evenings organizing papers during the final year of his life. He had not been preparing for his own absence. He had been protecting my independence. Before going to bed, I carefully placed his letter inside the top drawer of his desk and locked it. Then I looked out the window toward the maple tree glowing beneath the porch light. For the first time since losing Thomas, I no longer felt like someone being carried toward decisions made by other people. I felt like the woman my husband had always believed I was, someone fully capable of choosing her own future. And that realization quietly changed everything that would happen next. The next morning I woke before the alarm, not because I had slept poorly, but because my mind felt unusually clear. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I was no longer drifting from one suggestion to the next, wondering whether everyone else understood my future better than I did. His letter had quietly restored something I had not realized I had lost: confidence. I followed my usual routine without changing a thing. I watered the flowers along the front porch, enjoyed a simple breakfast, and drove to the neighborhood grocery store where the cashier still asked how I was doing. To everyone around me, I was simply another widow learning to live with loss. Only I knew that the uncertainty which had followed me for months was beginning to disappear. Shortly before noon, Brian called. "Good morning, Mom," he said warmly. "Lauren and I were talking about Friday's meeting. We just hope everything comes together so you do not have to worry anymore." I smiled, hearing genuine concern beneath his words. "I appreciate that," I replied. "I have been thinking carefully, and I am looking forward to meeting with everyone." There was a brief pause before he continued. "I think once everything is settled, life will feel a lot simpler." I noticed something Thomas would have noticed immediately. Brian spoke as though the decision itself had already been made. He never asked how I felt about the house or whether I had reached a conclusion. He simply assumed the meeting would confirm what everyone had been discussing for months. After we ended the call, I sat on the back patio with a cup of tea, watching a pair of robins gather twigs beneath the maple tree Thomas had planted decades earlier. He often reminded me that strong things were built patiently. Looking at those birds, I understood exactly what he meant. That afternoon, Lauren stopped by carrying a covered baking dish and her familiar warm smile. "I made too much chicken casserole," she laughed. "I thought you might enjoy some." I invited her inside, grateful for the thoughtful gesture. We shared coffee in the kitchen while sunlight filled the room through the large windows overlooking the garden. Our conversation wandered naturally from neighborhood news to Brian's work, summer travel plans, and memories of Thomas. It felt comfortable, almost effortless. Eventually, Lauren glanced around the kitchen before smiling thoughtfully. "This house has given your family so many wonderful memories," she said. "Whatever you decide after Friday, I just hope you choose the option that lets you enjoy life instead of worrying about maintenance and responsibilities." The comment was gentle, almost casual, yet I noticed that she spoke as though only one direction truly existed. She never asked whether I wanted to remain in the home Thomas and I had built together. Instead, she described what she believed would bring me the greatest peace. Months earlier, I probably would have accepted her opinion without much reflection. Now I simply listened. "I appreciate your concern," I answered with a smile. "There is certainly a great deal to think about." That response seemed to reassure her. She finished her coffee, hugged me warmly, and reminded me that she and Brian would meet me at Samuel's office on Friday. After she left, I remained at the kitchen table for several quiet minutes. I did not feel angry with Lauren. In many ways, I believe she honestly thought she was helping. The problem was not her willingness to offer advice. The problem was that everyone had gradually become more confident about my future than I had been allowed to become myself. That evening, Samuel called to confirm our appointment. Before ending the conversation, he said something remarkably simple. "Mrs. Parker, remember that there is no deadline for making a wise decision." After I thanked him, I unlocked the drawer containing Thomas's letter and read the final page once more. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. On Friday, I would walk into that conference room carrying something far more valuable than legal documents. I would carry the quiet certainty that the next chapter of my life would be written only when I decided the time was right. The morning of the meeting arrived with clear skies and the gentle warmth of late spring. I woke before sunrise, not because I was anxious, but because I had slept more peacefully than I had in many months. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I was not carrying the weight of uncertainty. I knew exactly what I would do. I prepared a simple breakfast, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and stood quietly by the kitchen window watching the sunlight spread across the backyard. The maple tree Thomas had planted so many years earlier cast long shadows across the lawn, just as it had every morning since it was little more than a sapling. Some things in life changed with surprising speed. Others grew stronger simply by remaining exactly where they belonged. Before leaving the house, I walked slowly through each room. The family photographs still covered the hallway walls. The dining room table where we celebrated birthdays remained polished and untouched. Thomas's reading chair sat beside the living room window, waiting for someone who would never return. I rested my hand lightly against its wooden arm for just a moment before picking up my purse. Inside it rested the envelope Samuel had given me. I did not need to read the letter again. Every important sentence was already committed to memory. During the drive downtown, Brian called. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. "Good morning, Mom," he said. "Lauren and I are already on our way. Everything should go smoothly today." I smiled softly to myself. "I am looking forward to seeing both of you," I answered. "Drive carefully." He thanked me, and after we ended the call I realized how completely convinced he had become that the meeting would unfold exactly as everyone expected. He was not trying to pressure me anymore. He simply believed the decisions had already been made. When I arrived at Samuel's office building, he welcomed me into a smaller conference room before the others. Arrived, we reviewed every document one final time, page by page. Samuel explained each provision carefully, answering every question with the same patience Thomas had admired for so many years. Nothing about the conversation felt hurried. Nothing felt complicated. It simply confirmed what Thomas had intended from the very beginning. Every meaningful decision belonged to me alone. Before we walked toward the larger conference room, Samuel looked at me with quiet reassurance. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "today is not about changing anyone's mind. It is simply about making certain that every decision is truly yours." I nodded. "That is exactly what Thomas wanted," I replied. Together we entered the conference room where Brian and Lauren were already waiting. Lauren stood to greet me with a warm smile and embraced me gently. She complimented my navy blue suit and asked whether I had slept well. Brian pulled out my chair before taking his own seat beside her. Fresh coffee rested on the conference table alongside neatly organized legal folders and several elegant fountain pens prepared for signatures. Everything looked orderly, calm, and completely ordinary. Lauren appeared remarkably relaxed. She chatted comfortably about summer plans, family gatherings, and how wonderful it would be once everything was finally settled. Brian listened quietly, occasionally smiling in agreement. Neither of them noticed the separate leather portfolio Samuel carried beneath his arm as he took his seat at the head of the table. They believed every important document had already been placed before them. They believed today's meeting existed only to confirm a future they had already imagined. I sat quietly, folded my hands, and returned Lauren's pleasant smile. She had every reason to believe she understood exactly how the afternoon would end. The only thing she did not know was that Thomas had quietly prepared for this day long before any of us realized it would ever arrive. Samuel began the meeting exactly as he always conducted every legal appointment, with patience, precision, and complete professionalism. He reviewed each document one page at a time, carefully explaining every section. Before moving to the next, his voice remained calm and measured, never rushing anyone seated around the table. Lauren listened comfortably, occasionally exchanging quiet smiles with Brian. She looked completely at ease, as though the outcome had already been decided long before any of us entered the room. Several routine documents were reviewed first. Dates were confirmed. Property records were explained. Financial summaries were organized neatly across the polished walnut table. Everything unfolded with such ordinary efficiency that anyone walking past the conference room would have assumed they were witnessing nothing more than another estate meeting approaching its conclusion. I remained silent, listening carefully while resting my hands beside the fountain pen Thomas had given me many years earlier. Every few moments I caught Lauren glancing toward the signature pages waiting near the end of the stack. Her confidence was almost effortless. She had no reason to expect anything different. After all, every conversation during the previous months had pointed toward this afternoon. When Samuel reached the final folder, he paused. Instead of sliding it toward me, he folded his hands and looked directly into my eyes. "Mrs. Parker," he said quietly, "before we continue with any final decisions, There is one additional matter your husband instructed me to address. The room became noticeably still. Brian frowned slightly, clearly surprised. Lauren's pleasant smile hesitated for the first time that afternoon before returning almost immediately. Samuel reached beneath the table and placed a separate leather portfolio in front of him. It was the same portfolio he had carried into the room without anyone appearing to notice. He opened it carefully and removed several certified documents along with the cream-colored envelope containing Thomas's handwritten letter. Approximately 11 months before his passing, Samuel continued, Thomas amended portions of his estate plan and left written instructions regarding these documents. Brian leaned forward. I do not remember hearing about any changes, he said. Samuel nodded respectfully. That is correct. Your father specifically instructed that these documents remain sealed unless Mrs. Parker first received an independent legal review before making any permanent decisions involving the family home or major estate assets. He carefully arranged the papers across the table so everyone could clearly see Thomas's unmistakable signature at the bottom of each page. No one spoke. The silence inside the room carried more weight than any argument ever could. Samuel continued speaking in the same composed tone. Under these amended provisions, every significant decision regarding the estate remains entirely Mrs. Parker's choice after full legal review and without any obligation to proceed today. Then he stopped. There was nothing else to explain. Thomas had already said everything through the documents he prepared months before any of us imagined this meeting would take place. Brian lowered his eyes toward his father's signature. I watched recognition slowly replace confusion across his face. He had seen that handwriting throughout his entire life on birthday cards, handwritten notes, Christmas gifts, and countless family letters. It was impossible to mistake. Lauren remained perfectly still, although the confidence she carried into the meeting had quietly disappeared. She looked from the documents to Samuel and then toward me without saying a single word. I reached into my purse, removed Thomas's letter, and placed it gently beside the legal papers. Your father trusted me, I said softly to Brian. More importantly, he trusted me to decide when I was ready. Samuel quietly placed the fountain pen beside my folder and stepped back from the table. He never asked me to sign. He simply waited. In that single moment, everyone in the room finally understood something Thomas had known all along. The future had never belonged to the person who believed they controlled it. It belonged to the person who was free to choose it. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The silence settled across the conference room with surprising calm, as though every person present understood that words would only interrupt something much more important. Brian continued staring at the document spread. Across the polished table, his father's familiar signature rested at the bottom of every page, impossible to question and impossible to ignore. Lauren slowly lowered her eyes toward the legal papers before looking back at Samuel. I thought everything had already been arranged, she said quietly, her voice noticeably softer than it had been only minutes earlier. Samuel answered with the same professionalism he had shown throughout the meeting. Thomas arranged for Mrs. Parker to have every opportunity to make these decisions independently. That was always his intention. He offered no further explanation because none was necessary. The documents spoke clearly enough on their own. Brian finally looked toward me. There was no frustration in his expression, only genuine confusion mixed with regret. Mom, he said carefully, did you know about these papers before today? I nodded gently. I learned about them 2 days ago when Samuel asked me to meet with him. He lowered his eyes again, absorbing everything he had just heard. Why did you not tell us? He asked after a long pause. I smiled softly. Because your father wanted me to understand everything completely before discussing it with anyone else. I believed I owed him that much. Brian leaned back in his chair and remained silent. I could almost see memories moving through his mind, memories of Thomas teaching him to read every contract before signing it, reminding him that patience was often wiser than certainty, and encouraging him to think for himself instead of following the loudest opinion in the room. Lauren folded her hands together on the table. She appeared thoughtful rather than argumentative. Whatever expectations she had carried into the meeting had quietly disappeared. I reached for the fountain pen Thomas had given me years earlier and held it lightly between my fingers. Every eye in the room followed the movement. Then, instead of removing the cap, I carefully placed the pen back on the table exactly where it had been. I will not be signing these documents today, I said calmly. No one interrupted. This is not because I disagree with everything we have discussed. It is because your father reminded me that important decisions deserve time. For many months, I believed I needed to hurry because everyone around me seemed certain about what should happen next. Today, I finally understand that certainty belongs to the person making the decision, not the people waiting for it. Brian slowly nodded. I understand, he said quietly, although his voice carried the uncertainty of someone still trying to understand himself. I believed he was being honest. Samuel gathered the and signed signature pages without showing even the slightest disappointment. There is absolutely no requirement that anything be finalized today, he said. We can schedule another meeting whenever Mrs. Parker feels ready. Lauren looked toward me with a thoughtful expression that seemed very different from the confident smile she had worn when the meeting began. I only wanted what I believed would make things easier, she said softly. I met her eyes without anger. Sometimes the easiest decision is not the right one, I answered. Sometimes the right decision simply needs more time. No one argued after that. Samuel organized the documents neatly inside their folders while the afternoon sunlight continued filling the room with a warm golden glow. As I placed Thomas's letter back inside my purse, I realized something had quietly changed. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had raised a voice. There had been no confrontation, no celebration, and no humiliation. Yet the balance inside the room was completely different. For the first time since Thomas passed away, everyone understood that my future would never again be shaped by assumptions. It would be shaped by my own decisions, made at my own pace, exactly as the man who loved me had always hoped. When I stepped out of Samuel's office that afternoon, I did not feel triumphant. I felt peaceful. There is a quiet difference between the two. Triumph often comes from defeating someone else. Peace comes from finally being true to yourself. The warm spring air drifted through downtown Chicago as people hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that my life had changed inside a conference room only moments earlier. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, closed my eyes, and silently thanked Thomas. He had never tried to control my future. He had simply protected my ability to choose it for myself. As I started toward my car, I heard footsteps behind me. Mom. Brian's voice stopped me before I reached the parking garage entrance. I turned to find him standing alone. His shoulders were lower than they had been when he arrived that morning, and his expression reminded me of the thoughtful young man his father had worked so hard to raise. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, Brian took a slow breath. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not because the meeting surprised me, because somewhere along the way, I stopped listening to you. I listened to plans, opinions, and practical solutions, but I stopped asking what you wanted. I looked at my son for several long seconds before answering. Your father used to tell me that love is not measured by how many decisions we make for someone. It is measured by how much respect we show for the decisions they make themselves. Brian lowered his eyes and nodded. I understand that now. I just wish I had understood it sooner. I gently squeezed his arm. Understanding arrives when people are willing to learn. That is all your father ever expected from either of us. We drove back to my house together. We did not spend the drive discussing legal documents or the meeting. Instead, we talked about Thomas. We laughed about the summer he insisted on building a wooden treehouse, even though neither of us believed he had measured the lumber correctly. We remembered Sunday mornings when he filled the kitchen with the smell of pancakes while old country music played softly on the radio. We remembered the countless little traditions that had quietly held our family together long before anyone ever discussed an estate plan. Over the following weeks, I made every important decision slowly, exactly as Thomas hoped I would. I chose to remain in the family home because it still felt like the place where my life belonged. I worked with Samuel to update my own estate plan so that my wishes would always be unmistakably clear. Brian began stopping by every Saturday morning again, sometimes bringing fresh pastries, other times simply bringing himself. We drank coffee on the front porch while watching neighbors walk their dogs beneath the maple tree Thomas had planted nearly 30 years earlier. Trust did not return all at once. Like that tree, it grew quietly through patience, consistency, and care. Lauren also changed in ways I had not expected. She never again assumed she knew what was best for me before asking. Our conversations became more thoughtful, our boundaries healthier, And although we never returned to the effortless closeness we once believed we shared, we discovered something far more genuine: respect. One evening, as the sun settled behind the maple tree and golden lights spread across the garden Thomas loved so much, I unfolded his final letter one last time. My eyes rested on the sentence that had carried me through every difficult moment since Samuel first placed that envelope in my hands. The greatest inheritance I can leave you is not what we own. It is the confidence to trust your own judgment. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside its envelope, and smiled toward the garden blooming outside my window. Thomas had not written the ending of my story. He had simply reminded me that the pen had always belonged to me. From that day forward, every new chapter would be written with wisdom instead of fear, patience instead of pressure, and the quiet confidence that no one could ever take away my right to choose my own future. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.